We've optimized our lives so hard that the real question is whether comfort is making us weaker before we even notice it. And if stress is not just in your head, but in your body, then what if the fastest path to strength is the thing everybody avoids most? That is where this gets interesting, because cold, breath, and discipline stop sounding like wellness trends and start sounding like a survival system. Let's get into the conversation. He really said comfort is the problem, and honestly, that hits hard. But also, that sounds like the kind of thing you say after climbing a mountain in underwear. Like, bro, of course the ice bath guy thinks sofas are spiritually dangerous. Still, the mission is wild. Love, strength, happiness, health. He is basically saying modern life drains people before they even notice. Which is rude because modern life already has enough bills. He keeps coming back to consumerism like it personally insulted him. But his argument is that stress is not just emotional, it is biological. That is the part I cannot just brush off. Because he is not only talking philosophy, he is saying the body can be trained. And the cold is the entry point because nobody wants to fake being brave in it. The cold does not care about your self-help book. He frames it like discomfort is a teacher, not an enemy. That actually is a brutal idea if you really think about it. He is basically saying we have optimized our way into weakness, which, to be fair, is a very efficient modern achievement. What did you make of him tying cold exposure to breathing and mind training? Because that is the weird part. It sounds mystical until the science starts showing up. And then suddenly it is not a vibe, it is a mechanism. Though I always get cautious when someone says they can basically unlock everything. Every wellness guy has one sentence that sounds like a superhero origin story. But his early trauma explanation gives it a different shape. Being almost lost at birth, being born into that panic, that matters. He seems to believe trauma does not just hurt you, it organizes your life. Like it quietly makes you search for something your whole life. That is actually bleak and beautiful at the same time. And then he finds the cold at 17 and says, wait, this is the answer. Which is such a chaotic sentence for a teenager to discover. He describes it like the cold shut down the thinking and opened feeling. That is a huge claim, but it is also very human. I do wonder how much of that is physiology and how much is meaning-making. Probably both, because humans love turning pain into a theory. The squatter years fascinated me more than the ice stuff, weirdly. He sounds weirdly happiest when he had almost nothing. Naked yoga in courtyards is such a sentence to say with confidence. And he says that was the best time of his life. There is something annoying and true in that. Because he is arguing that responsibility can become a cage. Mortgage, job, routine, all of it can slowly swallow the self. But I also think people romanticize instability when they are not trapped in it. Homelessness is not a wellness retreat, despite the branding. Exactly, it is easy to call poverty freedom from a warm studio. Yet he is not praising poverty, he is praising aliveness. And he keeps saying people have more life force than they know. That Kilimanjaro story is insane for that reason. 76 Lyme disease and then a 31-hour climb. That is not a biohacker, that is a villain origin story. But it does show why people get hooked on the method. He is saying the body has reserves that fear normally hides, and the mind is the gatekeeper that keeps shutting the door. The hard part is separating genuine capability from magical thinking, because some people hear this and immediately become unbearable at dinner. Yeah, one cold shower and suddenly they are a prophet. But then he drops into the grief story, and the room changes. That part was heavy. His wife taking her own life and leaving 4 children behind is devastating. There is nothing motivational about that kind of pain. It is just raw survival. And what is striking is how he says the cold helped him keep going. Not heal instantly, not fix the grief, just survive it. That is a more believable claim than the superhuman stuff. Because grief does not need a miracle, it needs a next step. He seems to think breath is the first step for almost everything. And honestly, that is the first thing any anxious person loses. They start breathing like they are late for a disaster, which, to be fair, is most of civilization. The science part gets interesting when he talks about the nervous system. He is saying breathing can influence the autonomic and immune systems. And that study where immune response changed is not nothing. That is where the whole thing stops being pure mysticism. Still, I want to know how much is replicable for the average person. Because elite extremes are inspiring, but medicine is about scale. Right, if one guy can do it, cool. But can it help 10,000 people? His answer seems to be yes if they learn the breathing properly, and if they stop treating comfort as the default condition. Which means our generation is cooked because we adore comfort. We have heated blankets, delivery apps, and emotional fragility. But maybe that is exactly why this conversation lands. He is not telling people to become monks. He is telling them to meet stress differently. And maybe grief, too. I keep coming back to his line that society never taught us how to handle emotion. That feels uncomfortably accurate. School teaches algebra, but not how to not unravel at 2 a.m., which is a weird curriculum gap, honestly. And that is why the cold for him becomes more than a stunt. It becomes a rehearsal for life when life turns cold anyway. That is the thing I actually liked most. He is not selling invincibility, he is selling resilience. And if even a fraction of that is real, that is huge. Also, I need to say it again, the man is extremely committed to the ice bath bit. Like every answer eventually circles back to the water. But maybe that obsession is the point. He found one thing that forced him to face himself without excuses, and then spent his life trying to turn it into a tool for other people. That part I respect a lot. Okay, and next we have to get into the breath itself, because that gets even crazier. How can one breath pattern change the whole state of the body like that? That is where the science and the almost spiritual language start colliding. And honestly, that collision is the best part of the whole thing. Let's keep going there next, because this is getting deeper fast. And if the breathing part is real, then the whole room changes. We should pull that thread next, especially the actual mechanics. Because if he is right, then people are sitting on a lot more power than they think. All right, let's go there in the next one. Episode 2 is where the breath and the body start really fighting back. The wild part is he talks like a mystic, but the claims sound like a lab report. That combination is dangerous because one half of you wants to roll your eyes. And the other half is like, wait, did he just say people can train the immune system? Then he goes, stop breathing after exhale and blood rushes to the brain. Which sounds like the sentence a man says right before becoming a legend or a lawsuit. But that is exactly why people pay attention, because he does not sound safe. He sounds like someone who keeps testing the edge until the edge gives up. And his whole worldview starts with this idea that comfort is making us weak, which is such an annoying sentence because there is a little truth in it. Everyone wants efficiency, convenience, temperature control, snacks, and silence. He basically looks at modern life and says, congratulations, you got softer. But his point is not just toughness for sport, it is toughness for sanity. He keeps saying stress drains us before we even notice it. That part feels less like philosophy and more like a diagnosis. And then he ties it to purpose, which is where it gets interesting. Because purpose is one of those words people use when they have no plan. But in his mouth it feels physical, like fuel, not a slogan. He is basically saying if you lose purpose, the system will happily replace it with consumption. That is a brutal sentence if you sit with it for a minute. Because a lot of people do not even realize they are living someone else's script. Wake up, buy things, chase status, pay rent, repeat, become a professional hamster. He would absolutely hate how funny that is, which makes it better. What I cannot ignore is that his life story is not decorative to the theory. It is the engine behind the theory. Being born in that traumatic moment almost lost, that clearly shaped everything. He keeps describing himself as a seeker, and it does not sound like branding. It sounds like somebody who never felt fully safe inside his own skin. And then the cold becomes this strange answer to that fear. The first time in the cold, he says it felt like spiritual truth. Most people get into icy water and find panic, not enlightenment. Yeah, most of us are not out there discovering nirvana between gasps. But I get the logic. The body is so loud in that moment that the mind loses its monopoly. He is saying the thinking brain gets shoved aside and the deeper brain wakes up. That sounds poetic until you realize he has been pushing it into measurable studies, which is the exact reason this conversation stays alive instead of floating away. Because once science starts nodding, the whole thing gets harder to dismiss. The squatting years are another huge part of this too. He says it was the happiest time of his life, which is such a gut punch. No money, barely any structure, and somehow more identity than the modern middle class. Turns out suffering is not always the thing ruining people. Sometimes the trap is the fancy apartment and the anxiety subscription. He is clearly arguing that too much protection can kill aliveness. Not always physically, but spiritually and emotionally for sure. Then he talks about his wife and the whole room changes. That is the part where the cold stops sounding like a stunt and starts sounding like survival. Her mental health declining, him raising 4 kids, the grief, the shock. And what is strange is how practical his grief becomes. He does not dress it up, he just says the pain had to go somewhere. Going into icy water to break grief thinking is such a raw sentence. Because it is not healing in a pretty way, it is almost emergency medicine. And the weird thing is that makes it believable. Pretty healing is for candles and marketing decks. This is more like get in the water or get swallowed by your own head. I also think his response to his children is revealing. He did not make death into a final word for them. He made it into a presence, which is psychologically interesting. Maybe that is the only way some families survive something that large. They did not get a neat explanation. They got a structure for continuing. And that is maybe the most underrated thing in his whole message. He keeps coming back to structure, not inspiration. Breath, cold, repetition, purpose, practice. That is his religion. Which is hilarious because he talks like a prophet but coaches like a drill sergeant. Very loving drill sergeant, but still a drill sergeant. And honestly, that mix may be why people trust him. He is not promising comfort, he is promising capacity. That is a much harder sell, and somehow a better one. Because comfort ages badly, but capacity compounds. If a person can handle cold, breath, grief, and stress better, everything shifts. Even if you reject half his language, you cannot ignore the frame. The frame is basically, your body is not a decorative object. Which is rude, honestly, because many of us treat it like one. And maybe that is the whole argument. Stop outsourcing your own power. Stop waiting for the world to make you resilient. Go find a controlled amount of chaos and learn from it. That sounds insane until you realize modern life already does it to you anyway. He is just insisting that you meet it on purpose. That is where I think the next part gets even crazier, because breathing is the doorway. And if the doorway is real, then the rest is not just personality. It becomes a method, which means anybody can test it. Or at least anybody brave enough to stop pretending their lungs are optional. That was nasty, but fair. I think what he really offers is permission to believe in untapped ability. Not magic, not fantasy, just a permission slip to try. And that is why the grief story matters so much. Because if he can build something from that level of loss, the method has weight. Not because pain makes you wise automatically, but because it makes excuses expensive. That is actually a very good line and also very annoying. All right, let's leave it there for a second because the breath piece is about to get technical. And that is where things go from inspiring to borderline unbelievable. Episode 2 is where the breathing starts touching the body in real time. Dude, the wild part is he is not talking about motivation, he is talking about machinery. Like your body is a system you forgot how to use. And apparently the manual is just cold water and suffering. That is the most human way to explain enlightenment, honestly. But I do think that is the core shock here. He is not selling belief. He is saying, test it on your own nervous system. Which is where I get interested, because that is very different from vibes. Bro, he basically insults comfort as a lifestyle choice. He sees warm cars and warm showers and thinks, problem. And then he flips it into preparedness, not punishment. That part is smart because he is not romanticizing pain. He is saying voluntary discomfort gives you range when life hits hard. The thing that got me is how early the trauma starts for him. Imagine being born into the wrong moment, literally fighting to get air. That kind of beginning can wire a person towards searching. And then at 17, he finds the lake and acts like it recognizes him. That is such a film scene, though. Absurdly cold water, existential breakthrough. But the emotional logic is real. He found a place where thinking stopped screaming. That is what people miss when they hear these stories. It is not about becoming superhuman. It is about becoming less trapped. And the squat years are so important because they challenge the whole success script. No money, no status, no mortgage, apparently maximum happiness. That is so offensive to every LinkedIn post alive. But he is not just being contrarian for fun. He genuinely believes too much structure can smother identity. And honestly, there is something to that. Not forever, but enough that people confuse survival with living. Exactly. And he keeps coming back to this idea of life force. That is the phrase, life force, and he treats it like an engine. The old guy on Kilimanjaro is the perfect example. 76, Lyme disease, and somehow 31 hours up a mountain. That is ridiculous on paper, like a dare that should fail. But he is using that story to say people are underestimating themselves. Which I buy emotionally, but I also want the guardrails. Because if you tell everyone they can do anything, some people will get hurt. Right, so the real claim is not infinite ability. It is that the body has more reserve than modern life admits. That is a very different and much more defensible thing. And then the grief hits, and suddenly the whole conversation gets heavier. That part is brutal because it is not inspirational in a neat way. It is just a man surviving the collapse of a life. The way he describes his wife is what makes it land. Not as a lesson, as a person. And then the mental illness escalates in a way that feels painfully human. You can hear how much shame and helplessness sits in that story. What do you even do when the person you love starts slipping away? Especially when you are already carrying 4 kids and almost no money. That is the part that wrecks me, because there is no cinematic rescue. There is just responsibility, bills, children, and then grief. And somehow he still tries to build warmth at home. That is where the cold becomes almost symbolic, right? It is the one thing he can choose when everything else is collapsing. I mean, that is powerful, but it also explains why people can overread the method. The cold did not erase the tragedy. It gave him a way to keep moving. And then the breath work enters as the first public doorway. This is where he shifts from personal myth to actual reproducible practice. Which matters, because if it only worked for the wizard, nobody cares. Exactly, we are not building a cult around one extremely cold Dutch man, though he is making a very strong case for one. The body stuff is what makes the whole thing stop being folklore. He is saying the autonomic nervous system is not as off-limits as people thought. And the idea that you can influence immunity with training is enormous. Not because it means magic, but because it means agency. That is the real fight here, agency versus helplessness. He is basically arguing that modern life trains helplessness by default. School, work, debt, pressure, all of it narrows the self. And then people call that maturity. Brutal, but fair. What I like is that he does not separate science from meaning. He wants the data, but he also wants the soul of it. That combination is why people listen. Because if it were only data, it would be cold. If it were only story, people would dismiss it. And if it were only cold, he would just be a very committed maniac. Which, to be fair, he kind of is. But the maniac part is what forces the conversation open. He makes you ask why discomfort became the enemy in the first place. And maybe why we are so afraid of our own capacity. That is the quiet sadness under all of this. People are not just stressed, they are estranged from themselves. So when he says breathe, he means start there, not end there. Start with the thing your body already knows how to do. Then maybe the rest of you remembers it is alive. All right, that is a gorgeous place to leave episode 1. We have got the cold, the grief, the mission, and the science set up. And next time the breathing gets even more dangerous in the best way. Episode 2 is where the body starts answering back. He is basically saying comfort is making us spiritually soft. And that is a wild accusation coming from a man in ice water. But he is not totally wrong, that is the annoying part. He keeps returning to this idea that stress drains the whole system. Not just mood, but energy, family, purpose, everything. That is why the cold works as a symbol and a tool. He is not saying suffer for fun, he is saying meet reality head on. Which is deeply rude, honestly, because reality is already rude. The whole thing starts with him getting born into chaos. That twin birth story is brutal, though. Almost suffocating, then arriving into cold hallway air. No wonder he frames his life like a search. He treats trauma like an engine, not just a wound. I mean, that can sound mystical if you are not careful. But he keeps dragging it back to lived experience. Then at 17, boom, the lake moment. That is the part where his whole philosophy locks in. He says the cold shut off the thinking brain and opened something deeper. He is talking about survival circuitry, not just willpower. And somehow that turns into enlightenment without the incense. Just water, breath, and a slightly deranged level of commitment. What I like is he is not pretending thought is the hero here. He keeps saying thought can trap you inside the system. That is where people push back because thought also built the system. Right, we use thinking to create the prison and then praised thinking. Fair, that is a very human scam. The squat years are interesting because they test his argument. He says he was happiest with almost nothing. That is the first real crack in the money equals meaning story. Though, let us be honest, not everyone can romanticize being broke. No, but he is pointing at freedom, not poverty. Freedom from the mortgage brain, the career panic, the fake ladder. Then the story gets heavier with his wife. That part hits because it is not philosophy anymore. It is grief, children, survival, and a house full of pain. And he is still having to function as the ground underneath everyone. That is the cruel trick of life. It does not pause for catastrophe. He says the cold gave him enough space to keep going. Not healing in a magical sense, just enough room to breathe. That is almost the whole thesis right there. Make room in the body, and the mind stops screaming so loudly. Then comes the science, which is where he gets dangerous. Because he is not just saying it feels true, he is saying they measured it. The breathing studies are the bridge between instinct and proof. And that is why people cannot dismiss him as only a spectacle. The immune response stuff is the part that really bends people. They trained volunteers and got similar effects. That is insane. That is not wellness fluff. That is a biology problem. The wild part is how simple the entry point is. He keeps saying breathe first before anything else, which is very inconvenient because everyone wants a 10-step hack. Everyone wants a supplement, a gadget, a shortcut. He is offering something far less glamorous and far harder. Sit with discomfort and stop running from your own nervous system. And that is why the ice bath is such a perfect image. You are not negotiating with the cold, you are negotiating with yourself. And yourself is a much more annoying opponent. I also love that he frames it as love, strength, happiness, health. Because otherwise it becomes macho suffering, and he clearly hates that. The message only works if it is for ordinary people too. Not superhumans, not mountain gods, just people who are tired. That is why the grief story matters so much. He is not selling invincibility, he is selling access. Access to a little more breath, a little more room, a little more life. That is a great place to land for now. Next time, we go deeper into the breathing itself and why it hits so hard. Episode 2 is where the body starts answering back.